At Immae, the cataphract arrives like a moving fortress, iron plates, mail, and a horse sealed inside armor. Built to punch straight through Roman certainty, Palmyra trusts that weight and shock. The legend of cavalry that cannot be stopped once it commits. Aurelian refuses the collision. He turns the battlefield into a measure of time, distance, and breath under a Syrian sun. The Romans run on purpose, and in that panic lies the trap that will strip the Invincible down to exhaustion, then to slaughter. The Roman East in the 3rd century was not a border, so much as a bleeding seam cities rich enough to tempt invaders, roads long enough to swallow reinforcements, and emperors rising and falling so fast that loyalty became a gamble. Every crisis stacked on the next raids on the frontiers, civil wars in the heartland, and a central authority that could promise protection one season and vanish the next. In that vacuum, Rome stopped feeling like a single will and started feeling like a distant rumor carried on tax demands and old titles. Palmyra rose in that gap as both shield and broker, an oasis city positioned to mediate trade and to blunt threats pressing in from the east. When Roman power wavered, Palmyra's leaders could act with speed that the empire no longer had, gathering men, money, and legitimacy from the simple fact that they could keep order when Rome could not. Under Zenobia's regency, that role could tilt from guardian to rival. As the Palmyrene state expanded its reach and began to behave like an empire in miniature, collecting obedience, projecting force, and speaking in the language of sovereignty. That is the real stake behind Immae, not a melodrama of rebel queen versus emperor, but a test case for contagion. If Palmyra can rule the East and survive the challenge, then every province learns the same lesson that Rome's authority ends wherever its armies cannot arrive in time. And when Aurelian rides east, he is not just marching toward an enemy, he is racing, a spreading idea. Aurelian's requirement list was impossible on purpose. Win fast enough that the map doesn't keep tearing. Win publicly enough that cities feel it before his standards even arrive. And win so decisively that the East relearns an old reflex obedience. A slow victory invites imitation. A quiet victory invites doubt. In a fractured empire, time is not measured in days but in defections. Because imperial politics spreads like a fever. If Palmyra can stand apart and thrive, then every frontier commander, every city council, every provincial elite starts to calculate in private. Rome's orders are negotiable, loyalty is optional, and survival belongs to whoever is closest and strongest. That is the trap Aurelian is trying to close, not merely around Zenobia, but around the idea that Rome can be ignored without consequence. His campaign has to move like a warning shot, carried by rumor and fear as much as by marching feet. So Immae cannot be just a battle of blades and broken shields. It has to be a message written in motion, proof that Rome can still choose the terms of combat, still punish overconfidence, still reach the East with a disciplined hand. The coming clash is designed to do what speeches cannot shatter belief, and make the next city open its gates before the next spear is raised. The cataphract is not merely a rider, it is a decision made of iron and horseflesh. A battlefield argument that says one charge, one impact, and the question is settled. Armor turns flesh into a fortress, and momentum turns courage into a weapon. The sight alone can unmake an enemy line before the lances ever land. This is why Palmyra's elite heavy cavalry carries an invincible reputation, not because it cannot be harmed, but because it is built to make hesitation fatal. For Zenobia's Palmyra, that promise is a shortcut to control. Stop Aurelian in open battle, and the story spreads faster than any courier Rome can be checked. The East can stand on its own terms. And cities, weighing loyalty, will follow the side that looks inevitable. A decisive cavalry victory is more than tactics. It is theater, deterrence, and legitimacy compressed into a single afternoon. It answers the emperor's momentum with a spectacle meant to end the campaign before it becomes irreversible. But the cataphract's power comes with a price that cannot be bribed or threatened away. Metal holds heat. Weight devours stamina. And the system that thrives on the first collision begins to suffer when the fight becomes a long chase instead of a clean impact. The more it commits, the harder it is to stop, the more it pursues, the more it turns its own strength into a burden. And at Immae, Aurelian is preparing to make that burden do the killing. Aurelian's advance into the east carried a kind of gravity every mile forward pulled loyalties out of hiding, forced cities to choose, forced commanders to act before choice became surrender. Antioch loomed as a hinge point too valuable to abandon lightly, too exposed to defend forever. If the Roman tide kept rising, the closer the Romans came, the more the war stopped being abstract policy and became dust on the horizon. The sound of hooves on hard ground. The certainty that delay was its own defeat. For Palmyra, the logic was urgent and brutally simple. Halt him near Antioch, or watch momentum turn into inevitability. Accounts suggest Palmyrene leadership trusted in the cleanest kind of decision, heavy cavalry. A shock that could shatter Roman confidence and stop the campaign in one violent sentence. For home, the confidence was different, not in a single blow, but in controlled discipline that could absorb impact, maneuver that could rewrite the terms, and patience that could make an enemy spend strength in the wrong place. And now the distance between those assumptions collapses. Scouts and riders thread the space between armies. Rumors run faster than messengers. Civilians and elites in nearby cities listen for the first sounds that will tell them who to bet on. The air itself feels crowded, thick with heat and expectation, as if the land is holding its breath before impact. Everything about the approach says collision, and that is exactly what Palmyra is preparing to deliver. But what if the collision never comes? What if the first weakness, the Palmyrenes see Roman horsemen giving ground? A retreat that looks like panic is not a crack in Rome at all, but a mirage laid like bait across the plain at Immae. The fight begins, not with steel, but with a decision about what to believe. The cataphract does not ride into battle so much as it advances an armored man fused to an armored beast. A silhouette that turns sunlight into glare and fear into instinct, often protected in layers of metal and mail. The rider becomes a moving bulwark, and the horse beneath him becomes more than an animal part of the weapon. When that formation begins to roll forward, it promises a simple outcome, impact that cannot be argued with. A charge that turns hesitation into death. Its advantage is not mystical, it is mechanical and psychological at once. Armor blunts the first response arrows. Light blades, the frantic swipes of men who realize too late that they are striking a wall. Mass and speed concentrate into the lance point, and morale breaks before bodies do. Because the mind understands what the body will soon learn, you cannot stop a hammer by standing in front of it. In the right conditions, the cataphract makes a battlefield feel smaller, forcing an enemy to either run or be crushed. But the same system that wins the first collision begins to suffer the moment the battle stops cooperating. Metal holds heat, breath shortens, sweat has nowhere to go. The rider's protection becomes a furnace, and the horse's burden becomes a tax that compounds with every stride, especially when the pace must be sustained rather than spent in one decisive burst. Agility tightens, turns widen, and the temptation to keep pursuing, because stopping feels like admitting failure, can drag the cataphract into a fight it was never built to fight. Aurelian understands that truth like a weapon. He does not try to break the wall head-on. He tries to make the wall march farther than it can endure. Against cataphracts. And the killing edge is not always a spear. It is time. Contact comes fast, dust boiling up under hooves. The first clash of riders testing distance like a knife edge. Accounts describe Roman light cavalry meeting the Palmyrene advance and then giving ground. Not in a shattered panic, but in a controlled yielding that looks exactly like weakness when seen through the haze of speed. In battle, appearance is a weapon, and this appearance is irresistible. To the Palmyrenes, it likely signaled the moment their cataphracts were built. For the enemy is breaking, the line is opening. The victory is there for the taking. So the heavy cavalry commits. Steel and horseflesh surge forward. Lances lowered. The formation pressing into pursuit as if it can simply run Rome down and finish the war in one continuous motion. That decision feels safe because it feels familiar, because an enemy running usually means an enemy losing. And once the chase begins, stopping becomes its own kind of danger. To slow is to admit doubt, to break formation, to let the prey escape and turn the pursuit into embarrassment. Momentum becomes doctrine, and doctrine becomes a trap. The battlefield stretches, time lengthens. The Romans keep retreating just far enough to keep the cataphracts chasing, just fast enough to keep the illusion alive. The pursuers drag their weight across the plain, the pace turning from a killing burst into a long punishment. Horses labor, riders bake inside armor, and the clean geometry of the charge begins to dissolve into breathing and strain. What was meant to be a hammer blow becomes a grinding test of endurance, exactly the kind of fight a heavy cavalry is least suited to win. Then the mirage snaps shut. When the pursuers are blown and scattered by fatigue, the Romans wheel, aim and reform, and strike back into a force that can no longer accelerate, no longer turn quickly, no longer recover its shock. The rout reveals its teeth, light cavalry regains control of distance, and the exhausted cataphracts find themselves caught between armor that protects and armor that traps. Whether every detail of the maneuver unfolded as later narratives describe can be debated, but the logic is brutally consistent. Force the heavy cavalry to chase too far, and you don't have to break its armor at all. At Immae, Aurelian's retreat is not retreat. It is a blade made of patience, and it cuts by making the invincible spend itself dry under the sun. The Syrian sun does not watch Immae from above. It presses down into it. A third army made of glare and weight. Air shimmers over the plain. Breath tastes like dust, and every movement costs more than it should. In that kind of heat, war stops being only about courage and steel. It becomes a contest of bodies and animals forced past their limits. For light cavalry, fatigue can be managed, pace can be checked, distance can be traded. Lungs can recover in brief mercy as the rider regulates the horse. For cataphracts, the bargain is harsher. Armor holds warmth and turns exertion inward. Breath shortens faster. Sweat becomes trapped. And the horse beneath the metal burden labors under a load that punishes every extra stride. What makes the cataphract terrifying in the first impact becomes suffocating in the long pursuit. Because protection is weight, and weight is time converted into exhaustion. This is why Aurelian's deception bites so deep. He is not simply luring an enemy forward. He is dragging them into a climate where their greatest advantage taxes them with every heartbeat. The chase stretches, and the sun does what it always does. It extracts payment. Faster from the heavy than from the light. The invincible formation begins to fray, not from fear, but from physiology and strain. From horses overheating and riders losing the sharp control that shock tactics demand. And then the moment arrives when the cataphract can no longer answer the battlefield's question. When Rome turns back, the exhausted pursuers cannot accelerate into a fresh collision or pivot into a clean withdrawal. The hammer becomes an anchor right as Aurelian snaps the trap shut. The collapse at Immae is not a slow retreat, it is a snap. Like a taut line cut in midstrain. Pursuit turns into scatter. Formations lose their shape. The invincible arm that was supposed to decide the day finds itself decided instead. The shock is not only in the bodies left behind, but in the realization spreading through survivors they were not beaten by a stronger charge, but by a controlled absence, misdirection, fatigue, and a Roman turn timed like a trap springing shut. That kind of defeat doesn't stay on the field. It travels. Once the heavy cavalry's aura breaks, everything that depended on it starts to wobble: infantry confidence, command cohesion, the willingness to risk another stand in open ground. The loss likely forces a withdrawal toward Antioch, because holding a great city becomes harder when the army meant to shield it has been proven mortal. And in every nearby town and camp, watchers recalibrate in silence, weighing which banners can still protect them, which promises still have teeth. For Aurelian, the victory opens a door and creates momentum with a political echo. Antioch's security is suddenly in question, and the wider campaign shifts from uncertainty to pursuit not just of an army, but of the story that army can no longer tell. Immae is not the end of Palmyra's resistance. It is the first fracture in its defensive illusion, the moment the empire in miniature begins to feel the weight of Rome returning. Mercy can move faster than slaughter, because it turns fear into arithmetic. After Immae, Aurelian's campaign could be carried not only by marching columns, but by choices made behind city walls, choices shaped by what commanders and elites believed would happen if they resisted, and what might happen if they submitted. Where violence promises only ruin, restraint can offer a door, and a door can empty a battlefield before it forms. In that sense, clemency functions like a second weapon. When a city calculates that surrender will spare it, resistance becomes less heroic and more irrational, and the cost of defiance rises without a siege ever beginning. Each submission shortens the war's timeline, preserves Roman momentum, and isolates Zenobia's cause by making neutrality and even defection feel survivable. Immae breaks confidence in the field. Mercy exploits the crack in the political landscape, widening it until allies become liabilities and hesitation becomes collapse. This is restoration by incentives as much as by force, a strategy that does not rely on endless destruction to prove authority. It appears to have served a cold purpose: keep the road open, keep the campaign moving, and make the East feel that Rome's return is not only punishment, but a stable alternative. And with every spared city, the space around Zenobia tightens, her options narrow, her aura dims, and her empire begins to stand alone. The myth makes Immae sound like a single clever trick, a perfect feigned retreat that instantly destroys an invincible cavalry arm. Sources do emphasize that reversal, and it is memorable for a reason. But the likely reality is less magical and more demanding. The trap works because discipline sustains the deception. Because heavy cavalry, psychology makes pursuit feel like the obvious choice. And because conditions heat, 8-10 dastans, and fatigue turn armor from protection into pressure. In other words, the masterstroke only cuts because an entire system of timing and control holds the blade steady. That is why Immae matters beyond its own dust and blood. It signals that Rome, even in a battered century, can still learn faster than its rivals and punish overconfidence with adaptation. By breaking Palmyra's most frightening instrument in open view, the battle helps restore authority in the only language. Fractured provinces respect proof. Deterrence is not a proclamation, it is an outcome witnessed, repeated, and believed. And Immae feeds the broader narrative that the empire can still enforce unity. The modern takeaway is sharp, not comforting. The strongest tool on the field fails when it is forced to operate outside the conditions it was built for. And pride often supplies the push that makes it overcommit. At Immae, the fatal signal wasn't a spear point, it was a retreat that looked true for just long enough to be chased.